the release of Canon's new EOS R5 Mark II came a new battery, the LP-E6P. The fourth in the LP-E series, dating back to the original LP-E6 that first came out with the EOS 5D Mark II back in 2008. Now, of course, with this new battery, the burning question on the minds of many is simple. Does it give us more runtime if we use it in our EOS R5s? Now, certainly some of that interest came from the near 50% increase in record time that we saw on the EOS R5C. That said, call me a pessimist, but going into this and looking at this, I did not expect to see anything similar with the R5. It's certainly not in the case for video record times. The simple reality is that the E6P has the same capacity as the E6NH, 16 watt hours, and the R5 can already use basically all of that while recording with the older batteries. Now, with that said, the prediction isn't any good without some tests and some results. So initially, I was only going to do one video recording test. I was going to do this at 4K 24 frames per second in standard quality with IPB light compression. Got to fit everything on a card to make this work. Now, to get around the 30-minute record limit on the R5, I used my TC80N3 to automatically restart the camera's recording every 30 minutes and 5 seconds. Now, when using an LP-E6NH battery, I got exactly the same as Canon publishes for full HD quality recording, 2 hours and 20 minutes, which is also exactly what I would expect, given that 4K standard quality is, as best as I can tell, what's downsampled in the camera to produce the in-camera 2K outputs. So, swapping the battery for the LP-E6P, well, that resulted in the same record time. 2 hours, 17 minutes, and 44 seconds from a battery charged to 98% of its capacity, or correcting for that 3% extra or lost charge, 2 hours, 21 minutes, and 59 seconds. Now, of course, the big difference between the R5 and the R5C is that the R5C shoots everything in 8K and then downsamples that internally to your chosen output resolution, where the R5 will line skip in the standard quality modes. So, while my 4K test got the same recording time as Canon shows for 2K, which is what you would expect, would the same be true if I was shooting in 8K? Well, when recording in 8K, Canon says to expect 70 to 80 minutes depending on the temperature of the situation. And interestingly, this is about the same recording time that we see on the R5C with the E6P battery, so the cameras are actually now matching more or less. Now, the one big problem with shooting in 8K resolution on the R5 is heat, and in an effort to get through the tests in one run, which I think is ideal, I set up the camera's auto shutdown temperature to high and aimed some high-powered computer fans at the camera to keep it cool. Now, between the two, the camera didn't come close to overheating during testing. In fact, it never displayed the temperature warning, and it was never even warm to the touch, thanks in large part to the fans. So, how did the test go? Well, I got just shy of 80 minutes, or 1 hour and 18 minutes to be exact, of record time. This, of course, was on a 97% charged battery. For some reason, the batteries just were there. So basically, I got 1 hour and 20 minutes of almost exactly the amount of time that you would expect, accounting for the 3% short battery capacity. I didn't repeat this test with the NH battery. However, Canon's published battery life, as I said, for the LP-E6NH when recording in 8K RAW is 1 hour and 20 minutes. So it's exactly the same as what I saw with the E6P, and there is no improvement here, unlike what we saw with the R5C. So to make that long story short, there is no benefit to using the E6P battery on the R5 when shooting video, at least in terms of increased record times. Now, that said, for me at least, that's really not the most interesting question here. The more interesting question is, does the E6P battery affect burst shooting? And I'll just give you the short answer up front. I don't know, and I have no immediate plans to find out. Now, while I am open to potentially coming back to this, there are a number of reasons that, while I am very interested to know the answer, I'm also not very interested to do the testing to find out. So let me start with laying out the problem here, or the situation. One of the most power-demanding modes on the EOS R5 appears to be when shooting in continuous high plus drive mode with the electronic first-person shutter and a compatible lens. In this configuration, the camera can max out at 13 frames per second while maintaining autofocus, auto exposure, image stabilization, and all of the processing for every shot that you take. However, because the camera is driving the aperture and the stabilizer and the focus motors and all of the power that it needs to do all of that internal processing, the power draw in that configuration is significant enough that to maintain 13 frames a second, the camera has to be charged to 50% or higher. Once the battery drops below that 50% number, then the maximum frame rate will drop to 9.2 frames per second and then 6.8 frames per second at some point when it gets even lower. Testing this means putting a lot of what I consider to be relatively pointless wear and tear on my camera's shutter mechanism. And just to be clear here, my R5 is my own personal camera. It's not something that I bought specifically to beat on for testing for this channel, or that's on loan to me for the same similar purposes. So, how many frames would this require? Well, the answer is I'm not exactly sure. But I'm estimating in the range of 1,000 to 2,000 combined for both batteries, if not maybe more. Based on my experience with the R5 and other Canon cameras, I expect to see at least double the CIPA battery life when shooting in continuous mode, if not more. So for the published 320 or so frame CIPA battery rated life for the R5, we're talking about at least 600 frames in a test, if not more, to fully deplete the battery when doing continuous shooting. And then, of course, double that to get the results for 2 batteries. Now, granted, the shutter on the camera is rated for 500,000 actuations, and 2,000 exposures is only 0.4% of that. But again, this is my personal camera, and it's not something I want to beat on if I can avoid it. Now, the other bigger problem here actually in some ways is the test protocol itself. There is no industry standard protocol that I can follow here. The CIPA battery life test protocol does not deal with continuous drive modes at all. The question then is what is a reasonable test to set up for continuous shooting? How long do you shoot a burst before you stop? How long do you wait between bursts? Do you have the autofocus running during the entire time of the test and before and after the burst, or do you not use it at all? What exactly should you do? Practically speaking, when I'm shooting with continuous drive in the field, I typically shoot a burst that's a second or two long, and that's bracketed by several, maybe 30 seconds at most, of autofocus system operation. Track the thing coming in, shoot the burst when something interesting happens, etc. Now, to me, that seems like a realistic way of shooting continuous high bursts in a test situation, and therefore getting the kinds of frame counts that you could sort of realistically expect. But should that actually be the test case? And if so, what's the best way to enact that, and what times should be used? Bear in mind that part of the power draw that's going out the window when the camera is doing this is going to the lens's autofocus motors, and that power draw is going to vary from lens to lens. An older lens with a large or heavy focusing group may require significantly more power than a more modern lens or one with a very small light focusing group. On top of that, while the autofocus system might be active for the same amount of time in each repetition, that doesn't mean that the lens is moving the same amount for each test phase or repetition. So, should the autofocus be included to better reflect real use and therefore what you could actually expect in a more realistic way, or be excluded to better control for the test variables? Including autofocus also adds complexity to the test. The reality is I can't just plug my TC80N3 remote release in like I did with the video tests. I need to actually hook the camera up to a microcontroller to get that kind of control. Now, granted, this is something I've done before. I even got a video showing how to do it with an Arduino if you were so inclined, but it's also something that I don't have readily available and set up just to go, and not specifically for this application either. So, with all that said, I don't have a good answer here, both on how the test should be conducted and how to do it in a way that I don't feel is just putting useless wear and tear on my camera. So this is the part where I'd like to hear from y'all about still battery life testing. Specifically, I have a couple of questions. First is, what does your continuous shooting performance or operation look like? And I'm talking about in terms of how long do you shoot, how long your bursts are, preferably in time, and how you do autofocusing with that. Like, do you track something for many seconds and then shoot the burst or something like that? In that same vein, the question also is a more realistic test with autofocus use more important to you than a controlled test that's only looking at the camera's power difference between using these two batteries? The other question in this vein is, what do you consider would be an acceptable end state? That is it necessary to run the battery through the whole 100% range until the camera no longer is able to shoot to determine what the thresholds are and what the differences are? Or would it be good enough to maybe say run the camera down to the threshold where the focus or the drive mode light switches from green to white and the frame rate drops from 13 to 9, and just stop there, or at least just stop there if there isn't any difference between the two cameras? So let me know in the comments what you think would be a good way to do this, or maybe your preferred way to do this, or what you would maybe want to do if you were going to do this. And again, I'm not going to make any promises that this will happen or that I will revisit this, but it will certainly help me try to sort out what I might be interested in doing if push comes to shove in that direction. That said, I hope you found this useful, or at least interesting. If you did, let me know by hitting that like button. Also, if this kind of thing seems like it might be your kind of thing, please consider subscribing if you haven't already. Finally, if you'd like to help and support this channel, you can help us for free by liking this video, sharing it with your friends, and leaving a comment with your experiences. Likewise, you can support us by hitting that thanks button or buying yourself something you've always wanted from one of the affiliate links in the description below. And as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.